The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this commentary belong solely to the author and do not necessarily represent the views of our company, management, staff, or our affiliates.
The Starbuck News editorial of April 8th, 2024 posited that the carbon content per barrel of crude oil is 0.43 metric tons and concluded that the President Ali administration has a single-minded focus on extraction and infrastructure. Despite Starbuck News' presence at the Vice President's weekly press conference, the editorial mischievously ignored factual information to disseminate inaccuracies, perhaps intentionally. In a recent letter to the editor, I had pointed out that in a critical review of an article published by a Guyanese academic, that the carbon intensity of Guyana's crude oil is likely to be less than the average carbon intensity per barrel in the United States, which is 0.433 metric tons per barrel, which the author relied on, and now Starbuck News. The carbon content per barrel of crude oil varies based on geographic location and the type and quality of crude. In the case of Guyana, we have the light sweet crude, which means that the carbon intensity in our crude oil is more likely to be less than the carbon content of, say, Venezuela, for instance, because Venezuela has the heavier sour crude and the global weighted average. In my critical review of the said paper, I relied on a more recent, credible empirical study that utilized a global dataset to calculate the weighted average carbon intensity. The weighted average, according to that study, is 0.051 metric tons per barrel, whereas the average carbon intensity in the US, according to the US Environmental Protection Agency, is 0.433 metric tons per barrel. This means that the global weighted average is lower than the arithmetic average for the US. Subsequently, at his press conference held on March 28, 2024, the Vice President disclosed that the carbon content in our crude is 0.04 metric tons per barrel. This means that the carbon content in Guyana's crude is indeed lower than the global weighted average. As such, the carbon content for the proven reserves of 11 billion barrels thus far is an estimated 440 million metric tons, almost 5 times less than the 2 billion metric ton that the BBC reporter posited. Further, I would like the Starbuck News editorial to consider the following. Globally, the average annual climate finance flows reached almost US 1.3 trillion in 2021-2022, nearly doubling 2019 and 2020 levels. This increase was largely driven by mitigation finance, which was reportedly up by US 439 billion from 2019 to 2020. Adaptation finance continues to lag. While adaptation finance grew by 28% in 2022 compared to 2021, reaching an all-time high of US 63 billion, there is still a huge gap based on the estimated needs of US $212 billion per year by 2030 for developing countries alone. Climate finance globally continues to be sourced largely from traditional sources, such as grants and debt instruments from development finance institutions, accounting for 57% of all public finance. In that context, renewed emphasis on the strategic use of public funds and other concessional financing to mobilize significantly more private capital is imperative. Insofar as the global energy transition agenda is concerned, the world continues to lag behind on multiple fronts, such that it may ultimately render the 2050 goals unachievable. In this regard, there are a number of gaps to be bridged in order to reach net zero by 2050, such as the generation gap, the storage gap, and the funding gap. In particular, the total funding gap needs to almost triple. To keep on track with net zero emissions by 2050 goals, the IEA estimates that annual investment in clean energy will have to rise substantially from the projected 2023 level of US 1.8 trillion to US 4.6 trillion in 2030. Therefore, bridging the energy transition gap is likely to remain a challenging task in meeting those targets to narrow the gap. Against the foregoing background, the consequential effect is such that the global demand for fossil fuel remains buoyant amidst an increasingly focused global agenda on the energy transition goals by 2050. Global demand is expected to remain strong, especially since the US needs to rebuild its strategic reserves. The US strategic reserves was down to its lowest level in decades at 347 million barrels in 2023, down from a peak level of 727 million barrels in July 2011. Other countries such as India and China are also building up their strategic reserves as part of their energy security strategy. Finally, the Starbuck News editorial conveniently ignored the low carbon development strategy and the government's overarching development and transformation agenda altogether, that are not single minded focus but multifaceted focus.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this commentary belong solely to the author and do not necessarily represent the views of our company, management, staff, or our affiliates.